Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us on this IG Live. So glad that you're here if you're watching live or if you're watching later. My name is Deepa Iyer. I am with the Building Movement Project and it's great to have all of you here. Today we're going to be doing another breakdown in our series on the 10 social change roles. And today we'll be talking about caregivers. So I'm just going to give it a minute to let folks join us. And as you're coming into this space, I want to welcome you and also ask you to, in the comments, share with us what is the social change role that you're resonating with right now. So feel free to say hi. Feel free to let us know what social change role you're resonating with right now. And we'll get started in just a couple of seconds. All right, let's get started. It is really great to have you all here. If you're watching live or if you're watching later, my name is Deepa Iyer. I'm with the Building Movement Project, as I said earlier, and this is our series on the 10 social change roles. And today we're going to be talking about caregivers. So no matter where you're joining us from, I invite you in the comments to share the role or roles that are resonating with you right now. And if you're here, you likely know about the social change ecosystem framework, which is a framework that really allows us to think about how we support social change, systems change in our communities, our campuses, our country, in our movements. And what the social change ecosystem framework enables us to do and invites us to do is to get aligned with our values, to identify the roles that we play and the strengths and superpowers and skills and lived experiences that we're bringing into those roles, and to strengthen the ecosystems that we're part of. Again, those ecosystems could be your workplace, it could be your volunteer group, it could be a place of worship, it could be a campus group, it could be a social media community. Any sort of ecosystem where there is a sense of shared values, where you have certain goals that you're trying to reach in terms of moving an agenda or a campaign or a policy or a practice forward that leads to equity and inclusion and human rights. So that's really what we're talking about. And if you want to learn more about the framework, you can go on our website, buildingmovement.org. You can check out the link tree here on this handle or at mine, Deepa V. Iyer, and you can download a reflection guide that has the social change ecosystem map, that also has definitions of each of the roles, and that has a reflection guide with a lot of questions that you can take in order to understand how to apply the framework into your own life. So whether you're just getting started in social change work because you want to make a difference and you're motivated and driven to, or whether you have been in social change spaces for a really long time and are looking for a reset, this framework is an invitation to anybody depending on where they are in that trajectory and in that journey of social change. So I think that, today we're talking about caregivers. We're doing the series all year where every month we've been talking about a particular social change role. And this month we're talking about caregivers. And I feel like it's a really apt time, to be talking about care, especially community care, because we're grappling with so much right now. And we are relying on the caregivers among us to nourish us as we move through layers of grief and pain because of what is happening in our own lives, as well as in our communities and really in the world. I know that many of us are grappling with the news and images that we're seeing from Afghanistan, sending our thoughts to people there, people who are in Haiti and Lebanon. We are dealing with climate change in the world, in our own communities, backyards. We're also dealing with the ongoing impact of the pandemic and facing a lot of anxiety and confusion. And so this is a tough time. I have an 11-year-old son who's not vaccinated yet, who's going back to school, and that's something on my mind, and perhaps those kinds of things are on yours too. So it's not surprising then, right, that as we think about social change, that caregiving is an essential practice. And it's an essential practice in social change work, even if it isn't necessarily visible or public, because oftentimes social change ecosystems don't recognize and acknowledge the caregivers. And so I really hope that in this conversation, we can begin to do that a little bit more. So if you're joining us, let me know in the comments whether you are a caregiver or if you are resonating with any of the other 10 roles in the ecosystem. It would be great to know who we have in our space today. So I want to start by just talking a little bit about some of the strengths that we think about when we think of caregivers, and talk a little bit also about what community care is. So first and foremost, when we think of the strengths of caregivers, right, these are people who are engaging in acts of service at some level to benefit those in their ecosystems. And these are folks who are really perceptive. They're intuitive. They kind of have this sense of what is needed in their ecosystems and with the people that they're supporting. And they're able to provide that. And they're able to provide that in a way that is extremely connected to what someone else needs. So other strengths of caregivers include the importance of communicating availability, to say and to identify as a caregiver, right? Also asking oftentimes about needs and boundaries so that they're not overstepping or that they're not providing care when it's perhaps not able to be received. So caregivers have the ability to communicate with those that they want to give care to ask and to say, I'm here for you. I notice that you're going through a difficult time, or I notice that you are a frontline responder right now dealing with community crises, and I want to be here for you to provide you with care and support. Here are some ways I can do that. What resonates with you? What do you need? How often do you need it? So caregivers are people who are perceptive in that way, to know that care is needed, but also have the ability to communicate what they're able to give and to ask what is needed. And so that's a really important trait when it comes to caregivers. And I want to recognize and thank you for folks who are putting into the chat. I encourage you to share if you do feel like you are a caregiver in your ecosystems, or if you're resonating with any other role. So thank you to Itzal Dama, who says that they're a parent of a 5-year-old and a trained healthcare chaplain and spiritual caregiver. And we see caregivers, right, in all sorts of ecosystems. I have spotted caregivers in an ecosystem that is dealing with a community crisis. So for example, when I think about the uprisings that happened last summer against anti-Black racism, right? There were a lot of frontline responders. There were a lot of disruptors who were on the streets, who were putting together rallies, who were demonstrating and acting to get the message across, right? In the wake of the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others. But I also saw caregivers, and I'm sure you did too, caregivers who were actually holding space for the frontline responders and the disruptors, who were perhaps nourishing them with bottles of water and food. Caregivers who were the first phone call that a disruptor or frontline responder made if they got into any sort of concerning situations. They are the ones that frontline responders and disruptors leaned on for support in order to process what they saw on the streets, what they experienced, and how that experience was actually affecting them, right? So in many ways, we see caregivers perhaps not in that public and visible way, but they're the ones that are supporting the frontline responders and the disruptors whom we might be seeing. So if you aren't someone who can be on the streets or who can be public, right, then you want to maybe think about how it's important to support others who are perhaps doing some of that you can't do or might not have the skills to do. So again, it shows us that there are so many different roles that we can cycle into depending on what our skills are and also what our situation is. I want to read another comment in the chat from Ikla Borg. I'm a caregiver for my partner who has a spinal cord injury. I left my other roles in the ecosystem to become a caregiver, and your map helps me to still see myself in it. Thank you for sharing that. I think one of the things particularly about caregivers, and I also want to send you some care as you think about, as I process what you've written about caring for your partner, and hope that your partner is moving along well, and thinking about how caregivers do so much for others in terms of acts of service, and oftentimes don't necessarily have the care themselves, right? So one of the needs to go on to the next section for caregivers is to understand their own boundaries of providing care to others. Because sometimes caregivers are sort of giving from a cup that might be empty because that is their instinct. So one of the questions to ask if you are a caregiver is, what are my boundaries? When can I step up to provide care? And how am I taking care of myself? And who am I leaning on? Who are the caregivers in my own ecosystem, right? Because healers and caregivers who give so much to strengthen our ecosystems also need healers and caregivers themselves. So identifying who cares for you is also really important, and how you need to receive that care. So for those of us who might not be caregivers, right, who see ourselves in other roles, it's also important to share with caregivers what our needs are and what our boundaries are, so that they feel that they are actually respecting them, and that they are they're providing care in the way that we can receive it and we can affirm it. I also want to share a little bit about who caregivers work well with. So we've talked a little bit about the strengths, right? Perceptive, intuitive, communicating availability, asking about boundaries and needs. We've talked about what some of the needs are of caregivers in terms of their own boundaries and providing and receiving care, and who they work well with. So I mentioned this earlier, but caregivers really work well with disruptors and frontline responders. So if you find yourself playing that role often, it's really important to understand who it is in your ecosystem who can play the role of a caregiver. And I just wanted to share a personal story around that, because for many years, particularly in the wake of September 11th, when I was working in South Asian American communities, I played the role of a frontline responder and a disruptor to deal with the backlash that we were facing in our communities because of hate violence and state violence. And it took me a long time to recognize that I had very few caregivers in my ecosystem. And it wasn't until some time into my work that a dear friend and someone who was also an executive director, Aparna Bhattacharya, saw me at an event, and she said to me, how are you taking care of yourself? It's been 10, 12 years after 9/11, and you've been doing this work kind of nonstop. How are you caring? And I really appreciated that, because what she did in that moment was to mirror something that perhaps I wasn't seeing in myself, but she saw it because of her, again, perceptive, intuitive qualities. And she asked a really direct question that at the moment I shrugged off, but later on I really started to think about, because I realized that I, along with so many others who are frontline responders, absorb a lot of vicarious and direct trauma, which is why caregivers in our ecosystems are so important. So if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. If you have anything to share about being a caregiver or receiving care from others in the ecosystem, please feel free to put that into the chat too. One other thing I wanted to quickly talk about in terms of caregivers in the ecosystem. So I talked earlier about the three components of the social change ecosystem. One being that it helps us get aligned with our values. Another being that it helps us identify the roles that we want to play in a particular situation. But the third is that the ecosystem is really all about relationships. And so caregivers are, I would say, one of those roles that actually tend to relationships, that tend to the preservation of relationships, right? And so there's a quote that I love from Grace Lee Boggs, who was an activist and scholar in Detroit, and who worked with the Asian American and Black communities often. And she talked a lot about the importance of critical connections, that what matters when it comes to advancing social change is not the critical mass, she said, but the critical connections between people. And in many ways, caregivers are the ones tending to those critical connections because they're paying attention to what is needed to sustain the people on the ecosystem, right? And so they're so important because they understand the value of sustainability and giving care to people to sustain their own work. It's really hard sometimes to continue to do social change work in our world, right? Because we are dealing with our own trauma. We're dealing with absorbing other people's trauma. We're dealing with cycles of crises that seem to never end. And we're oftentimes dealing with culture and practices that promote kind of overwork or productivity or performance and aren't as balanced as we need them to be. So in those kinds of ecosystems, it's really important that caregivers are present and that they're valued and affirmed and included, because they're the ones that are actually helping us to actually think about what we need in terms of sustaining our own work. So let me see if other folks have questions. And if not, feel free in the chat to please let us know if you are yourself a caregiver or if you are somebody who receives care from a caregiver in the ecosystem. Okay. All right. And then finally, so we've talked about strengths and traits of caregivers. We've talked about who they work well with. We've talked about sort of the importance of caregiving when it comes to strengthening the bonds between inside the ecosystem. And we've talked about some of the needs that caregivers have themselves. I'm so excited that Catherine is here, Catherine Foley, who works at the Building Movement Project with me. And thank you, Catherine, for joining us. Hi. We'll give Catherine a minute. Okay, as Catherine is coming on to join us, and I hope that she's able to. The reason that I wanted Catherine to join is because she is somebody who identifies as a caregiver, and so wanted to hear a little bit about what her experience has been when it comes to caregiving. So we'll see if she can join us in a moment. But the one thing I wanted to add about caregiving really quickly is that it is a practice that when I do workshops and trainings about the social change roles, it's a practice that a lot of people say is oftentimes obviously not visibly seen, right? It's behind the scenes, but it's also one that
sorry, I don't know what happened.
Oh, that's okay. You're totally great. I was just saying that oftentimes caregiving is a practice that's played by women or people who identify as women and femmes, and it's often not seen as a role that's as important perhaps as others, right? And I think in this ecosystem, we understand that there's not a hierarchy of what role is important. It's more about how these roles are connecting to each other. But now that you're on, I was saying that you identify as a caregiver when we have done the social change ecosystem framework at work, and Catherine's at the Building Movement Project and works closely with me and is someone that I really rely on to be a caregiver. So I wanted to ask you first, why is it that you identify with that role the most, Catherine, and how do you practice caregiving?
Sure. So I actually never would have used that term to like describe myself before I met you and before we like learned about the map and started using it. And I'm sorry if there's a little bit of feedback.
It's okay.
That once I had the word to like describe how I interact with other people, it actually fit pretty naturally for me. And it's honestly just a practice that I learned from like living and growing up with my mom, who is also a natural caregiver. And I practice it the way that she practices it, which is, just little things, little acts of service or things that you do for others. And for me, I may not be able to provide like the same level of care to every person in my life, but it is just little things like if you're meeting up with someone and you see a flower that you think they'll like, you bring them that flower, or you remember their favorite food. And when you go out to eat with them, or you go out and meet up with them, you bring them that food. Just
Yeah.
things like that.
Yeah. And that's what I was saying earlier. I think for a lot of caregivers, it's very natural. It's like a natural instinct to be observant and to know what could actually be helpful for someone else. And that really helps when you're doing social change work, right? Because you're actually thinking about, okay, this person has been working on a campaign for 6 months straight, and I want to check in on them. Or something has happened in the news that really affects a community that someone I care about is also part of. And so I want to actually hold space for them, right? Those are ways that folks can practice caregiving when it comes to social change as well. But I also wanted to ask you, what are some of the challenges of being a caregiver, whether it's in your personal life or also how it translates into social change spaces?
What I've noticed is I've grown up like around a lot of caregivers, whether it's my mom or her partner or friends who are just natural caregivers. And the thing that I always notice about those folks are that they're stubbornly independent, where they won't ask for help themselves. Is it bad, the connection?
No, I can hear you.
Okay, yeah, and I've seen it a lot. I've tried to not notice it in myself as well, but I notice a lot of people who are caregivers kind of refuse to accept help or refuse to accept the kind of care that they're willing to give to others. And
Yeah.
it's honestly something that I notice a lot with friends who like burn themselves out because they'll bend over backwards for other people when they're struggling and they won't ask for help themselves. So it's great to have an ecosystem full of caregivers, but then you'll have people who overextend themselves and don't, you know, I'm repeating myself, but accept care that they'll give readily.
Yeah. And so that's one of the ways in which there's room to grow for caregivers, right? The importance of understanding one's own boundaries and limits, the importance of having a sustainability plan for yourself, even if you're a caregiver. And I think everyone on the social change ecosystem framework we all need sustainability plans, but so do caregivers and healers, right? And then also knowing when you're pushing too far. And so it's so important to like keep those challenges in mind. I want to pull up a comment in the chat that came in from Emily. I provide care and support for other community leaders and change makers, and I also show up as a caregiver in other capacities. I'm an ED for a nonprofit, hold space for family and friends. Thanks for saying that. That was actually one of the last things on my sheet to read, which is that I've often found that caregivers play that role in multiple spaces. So it isn't just perhaps in one's personal life where the instinct comes naturally. They're playing it in terms of perhaps with their staff, right, in a workplace environment. They're playing it in terms of the activist community that they're part of. And so that's another way to think about as you do if you are mapping out your role, think about the different ecosystems that you're part of, whether it's personal, but obviously whether it's, work oriented and you're community oriented, and see if you're playing the same role every time. Because that's also an observation to help us get more self-aware. Because if we're showing up as caregivers in every ecosystem that we're part of, then it might lead to, at some point, as Catherine said, exhaustion and burnout. And that's the yellow light, right? That reminds us that we need to perhaps take a look at how much we're extending ourselves in all of these ecosystems and what we have left. So thank you for sharing that, Emily. Any thoughts on that, Catherine?
Yeah, that just made me think, like, I think guilt is like a pretty common thing for every role in the ecosystem, but for caregivers, it's like a particularly like
Mm,
difficult thing to work through because when someone asks you for help and you don't have the capacity to do it, you're going to feel guilty if you can't.
right. And how do you manage that? Are there any techniques that you use?
I'm trying to like work on setting boundaries and at least if I can't show up in the way that someone needs me to, offer some other alternative or like set up a time when I think I'll maybe have more headspace or mental space to help them in the way that I can.
Right. Because we cannot give from an empty cup, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, again, that self awareness of knowing when it's been too much is so important. And that's another part of this framework, right? It is a tool for self awareness to know if you're overextending yourself or if you're playing a role that isn't actually a role that um, um, gives you joy or gives you satisfaction or makes you feel fulfilled or makes you feel aligned with your values. All of that is so important to know. So you can either switch roles or make some changes in terms of your roles as well. So with that, I think we're going to close up soon in a couple of minutes. So I want to see if anyone has any other questions or if you have any other comments or observations coming up for you as we close up. But again, this has been another part of our series on the 10 social change roles. We've been talking about caregivers. We've talked about strengths, room to grow, whom caregivers work well with, the importance of caregivers in sustaining ecosystems, especially those that are responding to community crises. And we've talked about the importance of having a sustainability plan, whether you are a caregiver who naturally gives or if you're playing any other role in the ecosystem. And you can find all of our, how many have we done now, Catherine? 8? I think we've done 8.
I think yeah.
Yeah, we've done 8. And so we are really, we're going to keep doing them through the end of the year. So we invite you to actually watch the rest. We also invite you to come to our website, buildingmovement.org, to check out the map, the reflection guide. And the reflection guide has a lot of questions. So Emily, as you do your workshop tomorrow related to this, please take a look at the reflection guide and incorporate any of those questions in your workshop that might be particularly useful for others as they're thinking about how to sustain themselves in this work for the long run. So with that, we're going to close out and thank everyone for being here. And I know that this is a tough time for all of us on many levels. And I hope that you can take some time to provide care to yourself. It could be deep breathing. It could be putting your feet on the floor and feeling the earth. It could be taking rest and sleeping, right? However you practice your own care to yourself. And also to take a moment to give care to the community and ecosystem that you're part of in some way. So thank you so much. Thank you, Catherine, for being the caregiver in one of my ecosystems. I so appreciate you in so many ways. And we will be back in, I think, late September when we will be talking about frontline responders. And before we actually leave, I want to quickly say that over the next couple of weeks at the Building Movement Project in Solidarity Is, we're going to be providing a lot of content around the 20th anniversary of September 11th. I talked about that earlier today in terms of my own experiences. So we're going to be on September 14th curating a conversation with movement leaders. So we hope you'll check it out and join us so that we can learn about the history of the last 20 years and how that is affecting so much of what we see unfolding today. So hopefully you will join us for that as well. So with that, thanks everyone, and have a good rest of your week. And Catherine and I will see you next month. Take care.
Thank you so much, Deepa. Bye.
Bye.